I arrived at my daughter's Christmas dinner in an old pickup truck, with mud on my boots, a worn brown coat, and a basket of vegetables from my farm.
Before I even reached the dining room, I saw the disappointment on their faces. To them, I was not Anna's father. I was the poor old farmer she had spent her life trying to escape. They laughed at my truck, judged my clothes, and spoke about my daughter as though marrying into their family was the greatest opportunity she would ever receive. So I stayed quiet. My name is Alan Rodriguez. I'm 72 years old, and I have spent most of my life learning that people reveal their true character when they believe you have nothing to offer them. That night I let Mark believe exactly that. But while everyone else saw an aging farmer in a faded coat, his father kept watching me. The way I sat, the way I listened, the way I never once defended myself. And slowly his expression began to change. Because somewhere beneath the mud, the rust, and the old fabric, he had started to recognize who I really was. My hands were caked in dry North Carolina clay, the kind of deep, stubborn red that gets under your fingernails and stays there like a memory. I didn't mind. After 38 years of commanding men, polished brass, and the sterile cold of Pentagon briefings, the grit of the earth felt honest. I stood in the center of my small farm, the silence only broken by the distant idle of my old Ford pickup. I was 72, and to anyone driving past, I was just another retired old man trying to coax life out of a few acres of vegetables. I wore my uniform for the day, a pair of stained work pants and the brown canvas coat. The coat was a relic. The zipper had been replaced twice, and there was a crude hand-sewn repair on the left sleeve where the fabric had snagged on a barbed wire fence years ago. My wife, Georgina, had sewn that patch. She'd been gone for 6 years now, but when I slipped that coat on, I could still feel the phantom weight of her hand on my arm. Georgina was the only person who ever truly saw through the 4 stars on my shoulders. She used to look at me, even when I was surrounded by aides-de-camp and high-ranking officials, and whisper the one rule she lived by. Alan, if you ever want to know the true nature of a person, let them believe you have absolutely nothing to give them. Back then, I thought it was just her way of keeping my feet on the ground. Now, it was the lens through which I viewed the world. People see what they want to see. They see the Resold boots and the 20-year-old truck, and they assume my life is a desperate struggle to stretch a social security check. They don't see the $28,000 monthly military pension that hits my account like clockwork. They don't see the investment portfolio we built over decades, or the trust funds I'd quietly established for my daughter and future grandchildren. But that morning, my mind wasn't on my bank balance, it was on Mark Whitmore. My daughter, Anna, was the best thing I'd ever produced, better than any strategic victory or tactical maneuver. When she brought Mark home a year ago, I liked him. He was a young entrepreneur, sharp and hungry. He looked me in the eye when he shook my hand. But success is a dangerous drug, and Mark was overdosing on it. He'd recently secured a massive contract in medical equipment distribution, and I'd watched the man I once respected dissolve into a caricature of arrogance. He arrived at the farm an hour later, his luxury SUV kicking up a cloud of red dust that seemed to offend the vehicle's polished black paint. He stepped out, looking like he'd just walked off the cover of a corporate magazine, crisp Italian suit, shoes that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, and a watch that glittered like a taunt in the morning sun. "Jesus, Alan," Mark said, stepping gingerly over a puddle as if it were a minefield. He didn't hug me. He didn't even offer a hand. He just looked at my coat with a mixture of pity and disgust. "That coat belongs in a dumpster. Or a museum for the Great Depression. Which is it?" I didn't flinch. I've been insulted by world leaders. A 30-something businessman with a lease payment wasn't going to break my stride. "It's warm," I said simply, wiping my hands on a rag, "and it's paid for." Mark laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. So was the Titanic. "Look, I brought the papers for the Christmas dinner itinerary. It's a high-end club, Alan. My parents are going all out. You can't show up looking like you're there to bust the tables." I watched him, truly watched him. His eyes didn't stay on my face. They drifted to my old toolbox, my stained porch, and the peeling paint on the barn. He wasn't looking at a father-in-law. He was looking at a liability. "Anna tells me the business is doing well," I said, testing the waters. "Well, Alan, I'm not just doing well. I'm winning. I'm moving into the upper tier." He leaned against his SUV, careful not to let his suit touch the metal. The world is divided into two types of people, those who drive the engine and those who get run over. I'm done being the guy worried about the price of gas. He looked at me then, his gaze heavy with a condescending kind of charity. "Look, after the wedding, I've been talking to Anna. We think it's time you sold this place. It's a money pit. We could get you into a managed facility. Something clean, something modern. You wouldn't have to worry about your fixed income anymore." The word fixed income tasted like ash in the air. He assumed I was drowning, and he was offering to buy me a more expensive anchor. "I like the dirt, Mark. It reminds me where I came from," I replied. He rolled his eyes. "Spoken like someone who's never had the option to leave it. Just do me a favor. For Christmas, buy a new jacket. I'll even Venmo you the cash if things are tight this month. I don't want my business partners wondering if my wife's father is a vagrant." That was the moment the decision hardened in my chest like cooling steel. It wasn't about pride. It was about the mission. I had commanded thousands of soldiers. I knew that you never truly know a man until you see how he treats someone who can do nothing for him. Mark believed I was a spent shell, a retired farmer with a hole in his sleeve and a balance of zero in the bank. He didn't know that the man standing before him in the worn brown coat could buy his entire company with a single phone call. "I'll tell you what, Mark," I said, my voice dropping into the low, gravelly tone that used to make lieutenants sweat. "I'll be at that dinner. And I'll wear what's appropriate." "Good," he said, missing the edge in my voice entirely. He checked his watch, that damn glittering watch. "I've got a conference call. Don't work too hard, Alan. At your age, a heart attack is a hell of an expensive way to die." He climbed back into his climate-controlled bubble and sped away, leaving me standing in the red dust. I walked into my house. It was a modest place, filled with the scent of pine and the ghosts of 50 years of marriage. I went to the hallway and opened the small cedar chest Georgina had kept at the foot of our bed. Inside, beneath a layer of old letters and pressed flowers, lay a heavy blue folder. It contained the trust documents, the deed to the lake house, and the bank statements that would make Mark's head spin. Beside it sat my dress blues, the medals pinned in perfect, lethal rows. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the 4 stars of a general. I reached out and touched the cold metal of the stars. I could have worn them. I could have walked into that Christmas dinner and commanded the room before the first drink was poured. I could have crushed his arrogance with a single ID card. But then I wouldn't see the man. I'd only see the performance. I closed the chest and walked back to the kitchen, catching my reflection in the darkened window. The old brown coat was frayed, sun-coup, and utterly unimpressive. It was the perfect disguise. "Okay, Maggie," I whispered to the empty room, using the nickname I only used when we were alone. "Let's see if this boy is worth our daughter. Let's see what he does when he thinks there's nothing left to take." The hunt was on. I wasn't going to that dinner as a guest. I was going as an inspector general, and Mark Whitmore had no idea he was about to fail the most important audit of his life. The cold December air bit at my face as I navigated the winding roads of the upscale cul-de-sac. My old Ford pickup, A rattling bucket of rusted iron and memories felt like a blemish on the pristine asphalt. Every house I passed was a monument to excess, perfectly manicured hedges, glowing reindeer displays that probably cost more than my first tractor, and luxury SUVs that had never seen a speck of real dirt. I pulled into the driveway of the Whitmore estate. It was a sprawling, white-pillared mansion that screamed of new money and a desperate need to be noticed. I parked my truck right between a silver Porsche and a black Mercedes. The contrast was almost poetic. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed the basket I'd spent the morning preparing. Heavy heirloom potatoes, carrots still dusted with the soil of my farm, and a few jars of preserves I'd made using Georgina's old recipes. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was wearing the brown canvas coat, the one with the patched sleeve. Underneath was a simple flannel shirt. To Mark and his family, I didn't look like a retired four-star general who had commanded thousands of lives and managed budgets that could swallow their entire industry. I looked like a liability. I looked like the help that had forgotten to use the back door. That was the point. I wasn't here for the turkey. I was here for the truth. As I stepped onto the porch, the heavy oak door swung open before I could even knock. Mark stood there, dressed in a silk blend sweater that probably cost 3 months of a sergeant's pay. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Instead, his gaze dropped immediately to my feet, then flicked to the rusted tailgate of my truck. "Alan," he said, his voice carrying a forced, hollow warmth. "You actually drove that thing here. I thought you'd at least take a taxi. I don't want the neighbors thinking we're hosting a scrap metal drive." "It runs fine, Mark," I said, my voice as steady as a mountain. "It gets me from point A to point B. That's all a machine is supposed to do." He stepped aside to let me in, but his mother, Vivian, was already waiting in the foyer. She was draped in cashmere and enough gold jewelry to sink a small boat. When she saw me, her face contorted, not into anger, but into a look of profound, shivering disappointment. It was the look a socialite gives a stain on a white rug. "Oh, Alan," she breathed, her eyes darting to the dirt-smudged basket in my hands. "Is that dirt? You brought actual dirt into my house." "It's food, Vivian," I replied, holding the basket out. "Grown with my own hands. Best potatoes in the county." She didn't take the basket. She signaled a maid with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Take this to the kitchen. Have it sanitized if possible." She then turned back to me, her voice dropping to a sharp, patronizing whisper. "Next time, dear, a bottle of wine would suffice. Something from a label people actually recognize." The air in the house was thick with the scent of cinnamon and expensive perfume, but it felt suffocating. We moved into the dining room, where the table was set with silver and crystal that sparkled under a massive chandelier. My daughter, Anna, rushed over and hugged me, her eyes searching mine for any sign of hurt. I squeezed her hand. I was fine. I'd survived insurgencies. I could survive a dinner party. We sat down, and the interrogation began, or rather, the dismissal disguised as conversation. "So, Alan," Mark said, leaning back and swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux, "Anna tells me you're still refusing to sell that patch of dirt you call a farm. Why? It's a dead end. You're breaking your back for pennies." "I like the work," I said simply. "It keeps a man honest." Mark laughed, and it was a jagged, ugly sound. "Honesty doesn't pay the mortgage, Alan. Look around you. This is what success looks like. This is what winning looks like. You're living in a time capsule." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a cruel sort of pity. "I honestly don't know how Anna did it, escaping that humble life of yours. It's like she crawled out of a hole and finally found the sun." I felt Anna stiffen beside me. "Mark, that's enough," she whispered, her face flushing with shame. But Mark was on a roll. He looked at the other guests, a few of his business partners, and gestured toward my coat, which I'd draped over the back of my chair. "Look at that rag. I offered to buy him a new one, but he clings to it like it's made of gold. It's embarrassing. It's like he's trying to prove how little he's achieved. I took a slow sip of water. In the army, there's a term for this: intellectual overconfidence. Mark believed he held all the cards because he could count the zeros in his bank account. He didn't realize he was standing in the middle of a minefield I'd mapped out before he'd even finished his first drink. "A coat is just fabric, Mark," I said, my voice low and gravelly. "It's the man inside it that matters. I've seen men in rags lead armies, and I've seen men in tailored suits run like cowards the moment things got real." Mark's face hardened. "This isn't the army, Alan. This is the real world. In the real world, if you're still broke at 70, you're not a hero. You're a failure who made bad decisions." The table went silent. The air grew cold. Mark's father, Edward, who had been sitting quietly at the head of the table, suddenly stopped eating. Unlike Vivian and Mark, Edward hadn't been looking at my truck or my coat. He'd been watching my eyes. He'd been watching the way I sat, spine straight, shoulders square, radiating a stillness that only comes from decades of absolute authority. Edward cleared his throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Mark," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Shut up." Mark blinked, startled. "Dad, I'm just saying." "I told you to be quiet," Edward repeated. He turned his gaze to me. It wasn't the look of a man seeing a poor farmer. It was the look of a scout recognizing a predator in the brush. "You have a very specific way of holding yourself, Alan. I've only seen it a few times in my life. Usually in men who don't have to raise their voices to be obeyed." "I was taught to sit up straight, Edward," I said, offering nothing. "It's more than that," Edward countered, his eyes squinting as if trying to resolve a blurry image. "The way you move, the way you don't flinch when Mark barks like a small dog. You've been somewhere, haven't you? Somewhere where things actually mattered." Vivian rolled her eyes, oblivious. "Oh, Edward, don't be dramatic. He was in the army. Probably a mechanic or something. They all have that stiff posture. It's part of the fixed income lifestyle." Mark laughed again, emboldened by his mother. "Yeah, Dad, he's just a retired grunt who didn't plan ahead. Let's not turn a gardener into a war hero. It's pathetic." I looked at Mark, truly looked at him. I saw the insecurity masked by the expensive watch. I saw the arrogance of a man who thought respect was something you could buy at a dealership. He was a shell. A loud, shiny, empty shell. "You're right about one thing, Mark," I said, standing up slowly. The chair didn't scrape the floor. I lifted it with silent precision. "Retirement catches up with everyone, and when it does, you're left with nothing but the person you chose to be when you thought nobody was looking." "What is that supposed to mean?" Mark snapped. "It means—" "I've seen enough," I said. I reached for my brown coat. I could feel Edward's eyes burning into me, the gears in his head finally turning, realizing that the Laonong, old farmer, at his table carried the weight of 1,000 battles in his silence. I looked at Anna. "I'll see you tomorrow, sweetheart. Dad, wait." But I was already walking toward the door. I didn't rush, I didn't stomp. I walked with the measured pace of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Behind me, I heard Mark's voice one last time, loud and desperate to regain control of the room. "Yeah, go on, run back to your dirt. Just don't expect a handout when the property taxes come due." I didn't turn back. I climbed into my old truck, the engine roaring to life with a defiant growl that echoed off the Whitmore's white pillars. As I backed out, I saw Edward standing at the window, pulling the curtain aside. He looked pale. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd let a wolf into his sheepfold and hadn't realized the wolf was the one in charge. The test was halfway over. Mark had shown me exactly who he was. Now it was time to show him who I was. The pumpkin pie sat in the center of the table, smelling of cinnamon and false warmth. The festive lights of the Whitmore mansion twinkled with a predatory brightness. I sat there, my hands resting on the table, the sleeves of my worn brown coat looking like a stain against the white linen. The air in the room suddenly turned clinical. Edward, Mark's father, reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and slid a thick, heavy envelope across the polished oak. It didn't slide. It moved with the weight of a lead weights, coming to a dead stop right in front of me. "I think it's best we handle the logistics before the vows are exchanged," Edward said, his voice flat, drained of the holiday spirit. Mark leaned back, folding his arms. He wore a grin that I'd seen on corporate raiders and colonels who thought they'd won a battle before the first shot was fired. He looked at Anna, not with love, but with the appraising eye of a man checking a balance sheet. I opened the envelope. The paper was high grade, the kind that lawyers use when they're charging $500 an hour to gut someone. I didn't need a tactical map to see the battlefield. It was a premarital property agreement. A prenup. I read the first 3 pages in silence. The room was so quiet I could hear the crackle of the fireplace, a sound that usually meant home, but now sounded like something burning to the ground. The document was a massacre. It wasn't an agreement. It was a scorched earth policy. Anna was required to waive all rights to any assets Mark owned, any assets they might acquire together, and even any claim to spousal support. But the real poison was in the fine print. She would be held responsible for half of all marital debts, while having 0 claim to marital gains. It treated my daughter like a temporary tenant in her own future life. I turned to the page where they had estimated Anna's worth. It was listed as minimal. The document described her as having no significant assets and an expected inheritance of 0 value. "Is there a problem, Alan?" Mark asked. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "I'm just protecting the bloodline. I've worked too hard to let my success become a charity ward for people who didn't plan ahead." That was the shocking strike. He wasn't just talking about money. He was calling my daughter a parasite. Anna's face went bone white. She looked at the man she was supposed to marry, her eyes filling with a devastating clarity. "Mark, you wrote this. You think I'm an enemy you need to defend yourself against?" "It's business, Anna," Mark snapped, his voice sharp and metallic. "I'm not going to subsidize a lifetime of failure just because you have a romanticized view of poverty. Look at your father. That coat, that truck, that's the future I'm protecting us from." Vivian, Mark's mother, took a sip of her wine, her eyes cold. "We just want to make sure the family assets stay in the family, dear. We can't have someone drifting in and taking half of what Edward and Mark have built." I felt the old familiar steel rise in my spine. I hadn't felt this level of focused tactical coldness since I was in a command tent in a desert 3,000 miles away. I didn't get angry. Generals don't get angry. They execute. I reached into the inner pocket of my brown coat, the one Mark had called a rag earlier. I pulled out a thin leather folder. "You're right about one thing, Mark," I said, my voice dropping into that low, gravelly tone that used to make whole battalions go silent. "Family assets should be protected, but you've made a fatal tactical error. You've based your entire strategy on a false assumption." I pulled out a small blue card, my retired military identification. I slid it across the table toward Edward. Edward picked it up. He looked at the photo, then his eyes traveled down to the line beneath it. He stopped breathing. He looked at me, then back at the card. His face didn't just lose color. It turned the gray of wet ash. "Alan," Edward whispered. "General Alan Rodriguez, 4 stars." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb that had landed but hadn't detonated yet. Mark laughed, though it sounded like he was choking. "What? Dad, what are you talking about? He's a gardener. He grows pumpkins." Edward stood up so fast, his chair screeched against the floor. "Shut your mouth, Mark. Do you have any idea who is sitting at this table? This isn't a farmer. This is the man who ran the entire logistics command for the United States Army. I saw him speak at the Veterans Trust 3 years ago. He donated the building. I didn't look at Edward, I looked directly at Mark. His smug grin had dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "You were worried about Anna's inheritance, weren't you?" I asked, reaching back into the folder. I pulled out 3 documents, a trust summary, a bank statement, and a deed. "This is Anna's trust," I said, laying it on top of their cruel contract. "I established it 3 years ago. It holds the title to my home, the lake house, and a diversified investment portfolio Georgina and I built over 40 years. I pointed to the final number on the balance sheet. "The assets currently held in my daughter's name are triple the total value of your entire distribution company, Mark. She doesn't need your money. She never did." Vivian's wine glass clinked against her saucer. Her hand was shaking. A general, $28,000 a month in pension alone," she stammered, recalling the fixed income insults she'd lobbed earlier. I stood up. I didn't need the stars on my shoulders to command the room. The air around me felt heavy, charged with the authority of 38 years of service. I looked at the prenup, the document that treated my daughter like a gold digger. "I wore this coat tonight for a reason," I said, my voice echoing off their expensive walls. "I wanted to see who you were when you thought I had nothing to give you. I wanted to see how you treated a woman you believed was poor." I leaned over the table, my shadow falling over Mark. He looked small now, pathetic. "You failed the test, Mark. You didn't see a partner, you saw a liability. You didn't see a woman you loved, you saw a financial threat to be managed and neutralized." Anna stood up beside me. The hurt in her eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard fire. She looked at the engagement ring on her finger. A ring Mark had bragged about, and she pulled it off. She didn't place it on the table, she dropped it. It made a sharp, final clink against Mark's fine china. "My father is a great man not because of his rank, Mark," Anna said, her voice trembling but strong. "But because he would have treated a beggar with more respect than you've shown him tonight. You wanted to protect your assets? Congratulations, they're all you have left." I picked up my old brown coat. I felt the patch Georgina had sewn on the sleeve. It felt like her hand was on my shoulder, proud. "We're leaving," I said. "General, please," Edward started, his face pleading. "I had no idea. My son, he's been foolish." "He's been himself, Edward," I interrupted. "The contract just made it official. He isn't a man. He's a calculator with a silk tie." I walked toward the door. I could hear Mark trying to find his voice behind me, some desperate apology based on the new information he'd just received. But I didn't listen. I didn't need to. In the Army, we have a term for a mission that has been compromised beyond repair: broken arrow. As I stepped out into the cold night air and climbed into my rusted Ford pickup, I felt a strange sense of peace. The Laonong was gone. The general had finished his inspection, and the verdict was final. Mark had spent the evening trying to figure out how much I was worth. He never realized that by doing so, he had proven he was worth absolutely nothing. The silence on the drive back to the farm was heavier than any combat briefing I'd ever sat through. Anna sat in the passenger seat of my old Ford, her gaze fixed on the passing shadows of the dark North Carolina woods. She didn't cry. She was a Rodriguez. We processed the damage before we let out the scream. When we reached the porch, the headlights of a familiar luxury SUV were already cutting through the red dust of my driveway. Mark was leaning against the hood, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a mask of panicked desperation. He'd beaten us there, likely driving like a maniac to outrun the truth he'd just discovered. He stepped forward as soon as Anna opened her door. "Anna, wait. Please, I didn't know. I swear, if I had known who your father was." "That's exactly the problem, Mark," Anna interrupted, her voice as sharp and cold as a bayonet. She stood under the dim yellow porch light, looking at him as if he were a stranger she just caught trespassing. You only give a damn because you found out he's a general with a mountain of cash. If he were just a poor farmer in a sewn coup coat, you'd still be looking at him like he was something you stepped in. I was just trying to be smart. My family. We almost lost everything when I was a kid. I was scared. Mark's voice cracked, a jagged sound of a man watching his carefully built world catch fire. Anna didn't hesitate. She reached down, slid the diamond engagement ring off her finger, the glittering piece of collateral he'd been so proud of, and pressed it into his palm. Postpone the wedding, Mark. Actually, let's not call it a postponement. Let's call it an audit. Go home and figure out if there's a man left inside that suit, or if it's just a calculator with a heartbeat. She walked into the house and shut the door. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was final. Mark stood there, gutted, holding a $100,000 rock in a hand that was visibly shaking. I stayed on the porch, leaning against the railing. I didn't say a word. I just watched him. "General," he whispered, looking up at me. "Don't," I said, the word coming from my gut. "You haven't earned that title from me, and you sure as hell haven't earned the right to call me Dad again. You want to fix this?" Words are cheap, and I know exactly how much your words are worth. Nothing. The next 2 weeks were quiet. Anna stayed at the farm, helping me with the winter harvest. Then, on a freezing Saturday morning at 05 weather, the black SUV returned. Mark stepped out, but he wasn't wearing a suit. He had on a pair of stiff new work boots and a denim jacket that looked like it had never seen a day of labor. "I want to help," he said. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red. I handed him a shovel and pointed toward the north fence line where the red clay had washed out a series of posts. "Dig," I told him. "If you stop before the sun goes down, don't bother coming back next week." By noon, his new boots were coated in 3 pounds of thick, stubborn mud. His hands, usually reserved for tapping on touchscreens and signing contracts, were covered in raw, weeping blisters. He looked pathetic. He looked like a man who had never had to fight for anything that couldn't be bought. Every time he slowed down, I'd be there, leaning against a post, watching him with the same detachment I'd used on fresh recruits at West Point. "This is pointless," he hissed at one point, throwing the shovel down. "I have a company to run. I have people who do this for me." "Then go back to them," I barked, stepping into his space. "Go back to your bubble where everyone smiles at you because you sign their checks. But don't you dare look at my daughter again. You think this is about offense. This is about whether you have the spine to do something that doesn't benefit your bank account." He stared at me, his chest heaving. For a second, I thought he'd swing. Instead, he picked up the shovel and went back to the clay. That was the beginning of the Sunday deliveries. Every weekend, I'd make him load the old Ford pickup, the one he'd called a scrap metal drive, just weeks before. We didn't go to the high-end markets. We went to the small town squares and the back road porches where the families struggled to make ends meet. I watched him as we delivered crates of potatoes and pumpkins. In the beginning, he acted like he was on a campaign trail, handing out vegetables with a fake, practiced smile. But that changed when we met Martha, the waitress from the diner. She didn't know who I was, and she certainly didn't know Mark. She just saw 2 men bringing her a month's worth of preserves and fresh produce for her grandkids. She reached out and hugged Mark, her hands stained with the grease of a double shift. Mark froze. He looked at me, then back at this woman who had nothing to give him but a thank you. "She thinks I'm a good person," Mark whispered as we drove away, his voice thick with a sudden, raw realization. "No," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "She thinks you're a human being. The question is, do you?" The internal shift started small, like a slow-burning fuse. Mark stopped talking about protecting assets and started talking about vulnerability. One Sunday, he told me he'd fired his lead distribution manager. Not because the guy missed his numbers, but because he'd caught him mocking a warehouse worker for wearing old clothes. I realized I was looking in a mirror when I watched that guy. Mark told me as we repaired the tractor engine, his face smeared with oil. I saw the same smug, arrogant prick I used to be. I couldn't stand the sight of him. But the real test came in April. I'd started taking him to the VA hospital. I told him to just sit and listen. No talking, no entrepreneurial advice, just listening. He sat with a Marine sergeant who had lost both legs and a medic who couldn't sleep because of the things he'd seen in a valley in Afghanistan. Mark didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, his money was useless. He couldn't buy these men their peace back. He just had to sit there in the silence and feel the weight of their sacrifice. A week later, without telling me or Anna, Mark diverted a massive shipment of medical supplies, thousands of dollars worth of high-end rehabilitation equipment, to the regional VA centers. He didn't put his company's name on it. He didn't call a press conference. He just used his distribution network to get it done, quietly, under the radar. I only found out because Edward, his father, called me. "Alan, I don't know what you're doing to my son, but keep doing it," Edward said, his voice sounding lighter than I'd ever heard it. "He's actually listening to people. He's acting like a man who deserves his last name." The final sign of the purge happened on a rainy morning in early May. Mark walked into the barn where I was sharpening a blade. He was carrying a small package. He handed it to me without a word. I opened it. It was my old brown canvas coat. He'd taken it, God knows when, and had the zipper replaced with a heavy-duty brass one. He'd had the lining reinforced with warm wool. But as I turned the sleeve, I saw it. The crude hand-sewn patch Georgina had made years ago was still there. He hadn't replaced it. He'd cleaned it, reinforced the stitching around it, and left it as the center of the garment. "I used to think everything old was a failure," Mark said, looking me in the eye. He wasn't flinching anymore. "I thought that patch was a sign of poverty. Now I know it's the most valuable thing you own. It's a story, and I'm sorry I tried to tell you to throw your stories away." I looked at the coat, then at him. He was dirty, his hands were scarred, and his ego had been ground into the red clay of my farm. He was finally stripped down to the bone. "The wedding is in 3 weeks, Mark," I said, slipping the coat on. The new zipper glided perfectly. "Don't wear that Italian suit. Wear something that won't make you afraid to shake a working man's hand." Mark nodded, a single, sharp movement. He didn't ask if Anna would be there. He knew the answer depended on the man he chose to be every morning when he woke up. The general's inspection was over. The man was starting to emerge. The morning sun of early May crawled over the horizon, painting the red clay of my farm in shades of bruised purple and gold. The air no longer carried the sharp, icy bite of that December night at the Whitmore mansion. Instead, it smelled of wet earth and blooming jasmine. I was in the barn, sharpening a spade, when a vehicle pulled up. It wasn't a luxury SUV this time. It was a modest, sensible truck Mark had bought recently that didn't mind a bit of dust. He stepped out, carrying a garment bag with a strange look of reverence on his face. He didn't wait for me to speak. He laid the bag on the workbench, right next to my sharpening stone. "I took something of yours a few weeks ago," Mark said, his voice steady. "I hope you can forgive the theft." I unzipped the bag. Inside lay my old brown canvas coat. At first, I felt a flash of protective heat. This was Georgina's last gift. But as I ran my hands over the fabric, I realized what he'd done. The flimsy, broken zipper had been replaced with a heavy-duty brass one that felt like it belonged on a tank. The inner lining, once shredded and thin, had been replaced with thick, rugged wool. My hand traveled to the left sleeve. I held my breath. If he had replaced the patch Georgina had sewn, the bridge between us would have collapsed right there. But he hadn't. The crude, hand-sewn repair was still there. He had reinforced the stitching around it with invisible thread, preserving every clumsy loop Georgina had made while she was tired and sick. I used to think that everything sewn coup, everything old and worn, was a failure that needed to be replaced, Mark said, looking me dead in the eye. I thought that patch was a sign of poverty. Now I know it's the most valuable thing in this barn. It's a story of a woman who loved you enough to fix what was broken. I realized I'm like that coat, Alan. I was broken, and you didn't throw me away. You just gave me a better lining. I slipped the coat on. It fit perfectly. It felt like a suit of armor. The paperwork is on the kitchen table, he added quietly. We walked into the house. There were no high-priced attorneys this time, no scorched earth policies printed on $500 paper. It was a new premarital agreement, drafted by a neutral party. It was transparent and fair. It didn't treat Anna like a financial enemy or a liability. It protected both of them equally, ensuring that if they built a life, they built it on common ground. Mark picked up a pen and signed it without looking at the numbers. I don't care about the trust funds or the pension anymore, Alan, he whispered. I'd marry her if we were living in that old Ford pickup. The wedding took place 3 days later. There were no white pillars, no valet parking, and no silk blend sweaters. We were at the small white church in the valley, the one Georgina had loved so much. The pews were filled with people who actually mattered, neighbors from the rural roots, Martha the waitress from the diner, and a row of grizzled veterans from my old unit who sat with their backs straight and their eyes sharp. Vivian sat in the front row. She wasn't wearing enough gold to sink a boat this time. She looked humbled, her gaze fixed on the simple wildflowers decorating the altar. Beside her, Edward caught my eye and gave a slow, respectful nod. He knew the inspection was over. I walked Anna down the aisle. She was radiant, not because of diamonds, but because of the peace in her eyes. When we reached the front, I didn't just hand her over. I looked at Mark. He was wearing a simple, dark suit, no glittering watch, no arrogance. Just a man. During the reception held in the church hall, Mark stood up to give his toast. The room went silent. He didn't talk about his company's growth or his newest distribution contract. He looked at the crowd, then he looked at me. Most of you know me as the guy who almost blew the best thing in his life because he couldn't see past a price tag, Mark said, his voice echoing in the humble hall. And many of you have recently found out that my father-in-law is a 4-star general. He paused, then gestured toward me. But I don't want to introduce him as a general today. Rank is borrowed, and titles eventually belong to someone else. I want to introduce him as Alan, the man who taught me that the moment you only respect someone because you've calculated their net worth, you haven't shown respect. You've just done a math problem. The veterans in the back let out a collective hooah. I felt a lump rise in my throat that no military medal could ever put there. As the sun began to set over the valley, I stood on the church steps, watching Anna and Mark drive away. They weren't in a limousine. They were in Mark's new truck, the one that knew how to handle red clay. I pulled my old brown coat tighter around me. The new wool was warm, but the heart beneath it was warmer. I realized that my wife, Margaret, had been right all those years ago. If you want to know someone's character, let them believe you have nothing. But there's a second half to that lesson she didn't live to tell me. True wealth isn't just knowing who the bad people are. It's having the courage to help a man find his soul again after he's lost it in the pursuit of gold. Forgiveness isn't a sign of weakness. It's the ultimate command decision. It's giving someone the chance to become the version of themselves they were always meant to be. In a world that screams at us to be someone, to own something, and to measure our success by the shine on our shoes, remember the man in the worn brown coat. Real power doesn't need to shout. Real wealth doesn't need to be advertised, and real respect can never be bought. It is forged in the dirt, in the quiet moments of honesty, and in the way we treat those who can do absolutely nothing for us. Don't let your net worth become a cage that locks out your human worth. If there is someone in your life you've judged by their cover, take a moment to look at the pages inside. You might find a general where you expected a gardener. Thank you for walking this journey with me through the red clay and the halls of character. If this story spoke to your heart or reminded you of someone who taught you the value of humility, please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey of family, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of character, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue to bring these stories to life. Until next time, keep your boots dirty and your heart clean. Thank you for watching.
Hear that two-tone humming, headed out to the highway. I should have seen it coming through the